Good morning. That wasn't very good. Today's meeting of the Affordable Housing Advisory Committee is called to order on this day, November 12th, 2024. Welcome, everyone. Agendas of today's meeting are at the entrance to the meeting room. Please remember to turn off your cell phones. To ensure a complete record of the committee's actions, we ask that each individual wishing to speak clearly state your name and spell your last name for the clerk. We ask that you limit your comments to 3 minutes. At this time, I would like to ask the board members to introduce themselves and state the fields you represent. I'm going to start to my right.
Good morning, Sherry Dweck from St. Petersburg College, representing Essential Services Personnel.
Hi, Christine Vaughn from St. Vincent de Paul, being an advocate for affordable housing.
Linda Byers, city resident, an advocate again for affordable housing.
Good morning, David Harder with Tampa Bay Neighborhood Housing Services, representing affordable housing development and construction.
Good morning, Councilmember Mike Menino, City of Clearwater.
Good morning, Sherry Sidoni, Clearwater Housing Authority, supporting affordable housing.
Good morning, Rick Bell, Habitat for Humanity of Nelson, West Pasco. Excuse me, Tampa Bay Gulf side, we just changed.
Lindsay Dacus Harrison, and I'm representing real estate.
And I am Robin Field, residential mortgage lender for affordable housing. This is the third of 4 meetings of this committee. I think our discussions have been very productive so far. I know we have a lot to discuss today, so let's get right to the agenda. Our first order of business is to approve the minutes of the committee's meetings on October 28th. May I have a motion to approve item 2.1?
Move to approve.
Second? All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? The minutes are approved. The main item on today's agenda is to continue our discussion led by Amanda Warner from Wade Trim. Ms. Warner, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. So today we're continuing our discussion of affordable housing incentive strategies. So this is our 3rd meeting. Let's see. That's okay. All right, good. Are you able to see the presentation where you are? Okay, great. All right, perfect. So just to review where we are at, we are in the September through November window where we're discussing updates to the local housing incentive strategy report. Our next stop is a public hearing on December 3rd. Once we get through that public hearing, we will go to City Council to get their approval of the local housing incentive strategy report, and that will be incorporated into the city's local housing assistance plan. So that is what we were moving towards. As you know, all meetings are starting at 9 a.m. So we've had our first meeting on September 10th, our second meeting on October 28th. We are today having our 3rd meeting on November 12th, and we're moving, as I mentioned, to that December 3rd meeting, which will be held as a public hearing. So the values, principles, and vision for the local housing incentive strategy report are that affordable housing supports a dynamic and competitive economy. It improves social well-being and builds a sense of community. The city aspires to have housing that fits the city's workforce, and everyone deserves a safe and affordable home. These are the affordable housing values that were confirmed by the previous committee in 2023, and at our last couple meetings, this committee reconfirmed those values. And in terms of affordable housing principles, there are 6 currently in the report. One is that affordable housing is affordable over the long term. It provides a diverse supply that provides for a mix of income levels and diverse needs of residents. It's designed to be sustainable, energy and cost efficient, and minimizes physical barriers to accessibility. Affordable housing is in aesthetic character with the surrounding neighborhood, strategically located and pedestrian oriented with access to mass transit, open spaces, educational institutions, and employment or workforce training opportunities, and it's incentivized to promote the incorporation of affordable housing into all housing developments. And again, this is sourced from the 2023 report, and at the last 2 meetings, this committee reconfirmed that. The affordable housing vision. So looking at the values and the principles, combining into that, all of that information into one cohesive vision, the City of Clearwater will incentivize the development of a diverse supply of housing that is safe, accessible, affordable, sustainable, and energy and cost efficient, that blends into the aesthetic character of all the city's neighborhoods, that is proximate to public amenities and employment opportunities, and which supports an inclusive community and the diverse needs of residents. So that is the vision created from all of those values and principles. And my understanding is that the committee is okay with continuing this into 2024. Is that correct? Okay. All right. All right. So local housing incentive strategies. So why are we here today? So incentive areas are required by the SHIP program. For the Affordable Housing Advisory Committee to review. There's 11 incentive areas that are required for review. Those are on the screen before you. The committee has to the minimum that the committee is required to review are these 11. So these 11 have to be discussed. Additionally, there are 5 additional incentives that the AHAC has added over the years. And those are adaptive reuse, land development code, communication marketing of affordable housing, financing, and partnerships. Those 5 are not requirements, but are continually discussed as they were added by the committee previously. So looking back to our first meeting on September 10th, the committee was asked what are the current barriers and incentives to affordable housing in the city of Clearwater. And the committee identified those on the screen. Those were renter cost burden, the high cost of rent and utilities and transportation related issues, rising interest rates and insurance costs for home ownership, lack of affordable housing for senior citizens, investor real estate competition, and condominium assessments. Those were the primary barriers identified. Additionally, the committee identified 3 incentives, or incentive areas, I should say, accessory dwelling units with a potential rebate program, density, and education and marketing of affordable housing incentives. And those were the ones that the committee discussed on September 10th. So looking forward to the next meeting, so now we're on October 28th, which was the second meeting. The committee went through and discussed individual recommendations that are in the current 2023 report, and then identified whether those incentives should be continued, modified, or removed from the report. So looking at the first incentive area, expedited review, the committee discussed the request for expedited permit processing for affordable housing activity form, and discussed how that form is used to expedite review of affordable housing development applications for all unit types. And if you recall, we talked about single family versus multifamily for that one. The committee also discussed that although city staff provides technical assistance to developers, a specific list of peer developer mentors has not been compiled. No building example plans have been submitted. However, Habitat for Humanity is in the process of creating plans for submittal, and that's something we talked about. And then we talked about the trifold brochure, which was required by a previous recommendation of the committee, and then that trifold brochure was created, the affordable housing permitting process at a glance, and that's available on the city's website. So those are the topic areas under expedited review that the committee discussed at the last meeting. So the current recommendation 1.1 was to continue to use the request for expedited permit processing for affordable housing activity form to fast track affordable housing projects. Single family projects submitted with this form will receive priority during the permit review process by completing reviews of single family permit reviews within 4 days of the initial submittal and within 3 days of all subsequent submittals. And then October 28th, the direction was to continue that recommendation with no change. Is that still the committee's sentiment? Okay. And feel free to jump in at any point as we go through these recommendations. At this point, we're just confirming the last discussion that was had on the 28th. So expedited review, recommendation 1.2. The Assistant Director of Economic Development and Housing and Permit Manager will continue to be the primary and secondary points of contact when submitting multifamily affordable housing projects. Through close coordination, these 2 staff positions will create and oversee an affordable housing one-stop streamlined permitting process, act as a liaison between the developer and all departments involved in the review and permitting process, organize and participate in pre-application meetings, provide necessary information and forms to the developer to avoid delays during the application review process, and create a process and definitive project requirement checklist for affordable housing projects for each level of review and stage of permitting. And then these bullets continue. create a definitive but feasible review timeline for affordable housing projects, considering variables such as the type, size, and impact in the community depending on the level and review stage of permitting. Release to the applicants and all city departments involved at once written statements for additional requirements and project determinations, and track the review process through the city's online e-permit system. And then finally, report to the developer the status of the application. And then October 28th, the direction was to continue that recommendation also with no change. Recommendation 1.3 under expedited review was to continue to improve customer service toward potential project applicants by maintaining a positive attitude, offering a quick response time via email or phone calls, making available project requirements and forms. And then the fourth bullet down was one where there was a recommendation to modify that bullet, providing a list of potential mentors experienced in affordable housing development by end of first quarter. The committee struck 2024 and revised it to 2025 and updated annually thereafter. If you recall, the discussion was that although city staff provides technical assistance to potential developers, there is no formal mentoring process. So that was continued so that city staff continues to work on that recommendation. Okay. And then finally, utilizing new technology to enhance administrative efficiencies and to educate developers about the city's affordable housing incentives and permitting process by means of link sharing, web forms, video webinars, virtual meetings, forums, and other tools. And the summary of that was just the change to that one bullet. So does that meet everybody's expectations? Okay. Very good. All right. Recommendation 1.4, also under expedited review. The same here. There was an edit to the timing on this particular recommendation. So instead of developed by end of first quarter 2024, it was just developed by the end of 2024. That was the change on this one. And annually update thereafter a brochure and other informational handouts to be published in a prominent location on the city's affordable housing webpage that explains the city's development approval and permitting process to developers, including but not limited to the relationship between city and county policies and the regulation of land use density intensity and city-sponsored incentives for affordable housing. So this was completed, and the modification was just to capture that it was done in 2024. So, okay. All right. And then the last one under expedited review, 1.5, encourage affordable housing developers of single-family homes to submit frequently used building example plans for pre-screening by the building official to further expedite the staff review process. As I mentioned, this was discussed, and it hasn't been completed yet, but it's in progress. And I think Habitat for Humanity, you mentioned the last one was in the process of putting some plans together to submit. So the committee discussed keeping this in there as it may come to fruition in the next year or so. Okay, right. All right, so modification of fees is the next incentive area. It's incentive area number 2. And at our last meeting on October 28th, the committee requested additional information regarding the degree to which the Economic Development and Housing Department assisted with payment of fees using funds designated for affordable housing. And I'll turn it over to Dylan.
Yeah, so we looked up the number of permits and also the amount that's been spent on impact fees by the housing department. So we've done 8 expedited permits. Now, I don't know that shows the full picture because not every developer actually adds that into their narrative as far as affordable housing or expedited permitting. It's not working. Oh, sorry. There we go. So what I was saying is we've done 8 permits, but I don't know that that shows the full story because not every developer puts expedited permitting or affordable housing in their narrative. So actually this has sparked a conversation between planning development, the clerk's office, and us on how to better track expedited permits. And then as far as the funding for impact fees, we've funded $7,521 worth of impact fees so far. And we have an allocation of $260,000 to go toward impact fees for various projects.
Quick question, thank you for the numbers, Dylan. 8 expedited permits, so help me understand, when a builder or a contractor submit those plans, they have to identify that application as expedited, or do we in-house identify it as expedited and stamp it through the process that way?
So the process is generally a developer, if they go to planning development or to us first, Housing will work with them to start the process. We'll kind of liaison the deal, and then when they submit building permits, the housing department provides them with a letter basically stating that it's affordable housing and we approve expedited permitting. The housing side does.
Okay, so it doesn't start early in the process to continue, which you would think would make it easier to count at the end how many went through the process?
Yes, exactly. Yeah, I agree. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I know for us, we work hand in hand with housing, and the expedited letter that we receive from housing, we forward to our general contractor, and that has to be submitted with the initial permit application right up front in that process. And so for our projects, typically, that is just part of our timeline in permit submittal for that process. And it could be that there are a lot of developers that don't know enough about that process that would it could be effective for those numbers, because there's a lot more than 8 affordable housing projects that are being done in the city of Clearwater. So.
Yeah, I would think so, and that's kind of why I was leaning that way, is if they're in the unknown of knowing they need to request it, do we say, hey, this is an easier process for you, and then stamp at that to push it through that channel without them initiating?
Yeah, well, I think too, now that we're having the conversation, I think that adding it even to the Excel application or the permit application, is this an affordable housing project? Check that yes. One's going to help us track it, and two, that may stimulate the developer to come back to housing and say, hey, I need the letter, and then that's submitted. So that way we don't miss any. And yeah, there likely are 8's to the conservative number. It's more likely around 40, but 8 we know for sure use expedited permits because it's in the narrative or the work description.
And I know I don't want to use the word browbeat or anything for our general contractor, but we encourage and make sure that our contractors know right up front that as they submit their permits, everything in the description says affordable housing. And we work diligently to do that education with our contractors so that it's very clear right from the start.
Are these numbers representative of single-family residential and multifamily?
Yes.
And the and are the multifamily units calculated individually or just the project?
As a project.
So currently, the application does not have an area that you would check if it's affordable housing.
I do not believe so, no.
And then you stated if that was added, then maybe the developer would know to go to housing. Maybe the developer would know to go to housing. Could there be something in the process that there is a checkbox on that application, and then from there, building initiates it going over to housing, so you guys can be in contact with the developer?
I think it's something we could discuss, sure. Yeah, usually planning and development or building, if it's an affordable housing project and they go to planning and development first, they will direct them over to us. And usually if you're developing affordable housing, you're gonna come over to us anyway because for the incentives.
All right, very good. All right, so recommendation 2.1 was to coordinate with Pinellas County regarding database rate flexibility within the multimodal impact fee to support the provision of affordable housing. Since this is already done, the recommendation was to continue this. Okay. And then 2.2 was annually assess the financial, legal, and administrative feasibility of reducing, refunding, or redefining by unit size the cost of impact fees and or permitting fees related to the development of affordable housing, with the goal of being on par with other municipalities in Pinellas County. And again, this was continued. Okay. All right, and then finally, the Planning and Development Department will continue to implement the fee schedule of fees, rates, and charges ordinance to provide for a reduction in the plan review and permit fees for single-family homes. Again, this was continued. Okay, all right. And then 2.4, the Economic Development Housing Department will continue to assist with the payment of plan review and permit fees and impact fees utilizing state and federal funds designated for affordable housing. also continue. All right. So before I go on to flexible densities regarding the discussion that was just had, is that a recommendation that the committee would like to include regarding adding a checkbox or considering a checkbox to the form in coordination with the building department when applications are submitted?
I think so. I think it just makes sense.
Okay, all right. We can work that in, and I'll bring that back on December 3rd as something to consider. And I'll look at the bulk of the recommendations and see where that would fit into the structure. So, okay, all right. And may go back under number 1 regarding the application forms process. So, incentive area number 3 is flexible densities. If you recall, we discussed density as an incentive during the September 10th, the first AHAC meeting. And the summary of the discussion to date is that the North Greenwood neighborhood and similar neighborhoods may benefit from a better zoning strategy. This is in process with city departments right now. They're looking at the North Greenwood neighborhood and some zoning strategies in particular there. And that there was committee support for incentivizing reasonable higher density to support affordable housing, and that there was also committee support for vertical development allowing multi-unit buildings on current lots. So that was something discussed both at the first meeting and the second meeting. The Live Local Act FAQ sheet has been completed and is available on the city's website. I know the committee had asked about that last time, and there's a link provided for you there about where that sheet is. I did go and look at that, and it's pretty detailed about the information that's provided regarding the Live Local Act. So that has already been done. So flexible densities, recommendation 3.1 from the original report is to continue to provide the allowance of density flexibility for affordable housing developments by city policy and to monitor state legislation regarding density flexibility, including but not limited to the Live Local Act. The city is already doing this, so that the direction from the committee on October 28th was to continue this. Okay. 3.2 was to maintain specific parameters to grant density flexibility for affordable housing projects as allowed in the Community Development Code within the different zoning districts. That is already in the Land Development Code, so the direction from the committee was to continue. And I will say the Live Local Act, of course, provides some preemptions as well related to affordable housing and zoning districts. Okay. All right, 3.3 is to continue to define the density allowance for an affordable housing project as part of a pre-application meeting prior to formal submission of the civil site engineering requirements. Again, this is to continue as the city is doing this already. Okay. And then moving on to incentive area number 4, infrastructure capacity. The current recommendation is a recommendation of no recommendation. The statement in the 2023 report was, we do not recommend that the city of Clearwater include the reservation of infrastructure capacity for housing for very low income persons, and moderate income persons as an incentive for the provision of affordable housing. The history behind this is that the city of Clearwater is pretty built out, and that the infrastructure that is here is already here to support any infill development that comes in. So that direction from October 28th was to continue. Is everybody comfortable with that? Okay. All right. Number 5 is accessory dwelling units. So this was discussed on September 10th and again on October 28th. The summary of the discussion was that investor-driven real estate and short-term rentals are barriers to affordable housing. There's also a significant lack of affordable housing for senior citizens in particular. There's a need to incentivize affordable housing construction and rehabilitation. So, for example, rebates up to a certain dollar amount if they meet affordability requirements. And it was discussed that the recent City of Clearwater Ordinance 9758-24 implemented the city's comprehensive plan policies regarding accessory dwelling units by providing corresponding standards in the Community Development Code. That is a recent ordinance, and that did bring those standards into the code. And the standards to allow flexibility for alternative unit types is still in progress. Those are things like co-housing or other unconventional unit types. Those standards haven't been incorporated yet, but I know staff has been considering bringing those into the Community Development Code. So, any comments? Yes.
This is an important one, I think, in our community, especially with the lack of land. I really think that ADUs, there's a lot of unknown throughout the community about it. We all hear ADU. If you ask many individuals in the community, they probably say, what the heck are they? What is that? So I think in all these, the education component cannot be misrepresented or misstated. I think that's hugely important in how we communicate and market that message. We've had, professionals on this board that are far more knowledgeable in this field than myself, in identifying the young first-time home buyers, as well as fixed-income elderly and persons with disabilities, are some of our most challenged in this community. And I think, this might be a very wise tool or well-used tool that's underutilized to fill some of those gaps in our community. But I just think that filling that gap requires a lot of education and marketing that we can, that I don't think we should neglect.
Any other comments regarding ADU?
I agree with you regarding education. There's a lot of components to ADUs that are restrictive, if you will. For example, the homestead comes to play when you have a rental unit on your property. And so it's imperative that we as staff and members of this committee try to reach out to the Pinellas County property appraiser to determine what restrictions might apply to ADUs in the city of Clearwater.
I think another thing that we have encountered in affordable housing development is that even though a lot of our work is directed for affordable home ownership, because we were a developer, the building department had mentioned that we would not be able to get a building permit to build an ADU because we were not ultimately the owner of that unit. And I can't remember, and it's my fault, that whether there's been any activity or clarification on that. But when our mission is to provide that home ownership, and we want to complement that potential income for a potential low-income buyer, there was a bit of a conflict with the building department in who can apply for the building permit in the ADU. And so if there's an update or clarification on how that works, I think that could go a long way.
I think the new ordinance, if you don't mind, I think what we established as a city was that the property must be owner occupied in order to have an ADU or a rental on the property. I don't think we went through any language restricting the building side of it, but it was mandated that it had to be owner occupied.
Chair, I have a question. As it applies to down payment assistance, are there any restrictions in the home rule or CDBG or SHIP that states that the property has to be a single-family residential unit?
In regard to down payment assistance?
Terry Malcolm-Smith, Housing Coordinator. The restriction we use in federal and state funding for ADU is an intensive requirement for monitoring any rental property that we assist with either SHIP or federal funds. There has to be like a land use restriction agreement that requires staff to go out every year and monitor these units. So while it seems attractive to assist homeowners with ADU, we have to look at the staff capacity to perform this, annual monitoring per unit. So I think that's why we pretty much, we encourage folks if they have the money to do so, but not to probably use federal and state funding if we don't have the staff to do the work to honor what's required of us, which is annual monitoring of all units.
An alternative, excuse me.
No, go ahead.
An alternative to that would be using CRA dollars on a rebate program or down payment assistance to new construction with ADU, because those are less restrictive I'm not that familiar with the CRA city's policy guidelines that was approved by the county, but I would imagine that if you use the CRA dollars, you may limit some of those restrictions.
Yeah, I think the CRA, and Jesus probably can speak to this, is probably limited to the North Greenwood revitalization area and some of the section of Clearwater.
Thank you. Jesus Nino, Interim Director for Economic Development and Housing. As far as increment funds from the Community Redevelopment Agency, it has to be basically the language in the Community Redevelopment Area plans for the North Greenwood area or downtown area. But down payment assistance is something that CRAs do around Florida. And like you said, it can be a lot less restrictive because we're more flexible and we're kind of built to be more agile and so forth, but it has to be in our plan. And we haven't really looked at that section to see if it's in there, but affordable housing is a key component to our North Greenwood Community Development Area Plan.
Thank you.
And if you don't mind, I just had a question for you. When you discussed and identified the burdens of staff, resources, and hours to annually monitor ADUs, what exactly are we monitoring?
So the restriction for rental housing for the state and the federal program is that those units should be occupied by low-income people, meaning that folks, household that are 80% or less median income. So that means staff would have to make sure that the units are occupied by low-income folks. Lease agreement can not have certain provisions. Make sure that the rent, the limits are in accordance with the state and the federal. So there's a list of things that we'd have to make sure that are in place and make sure that they're following the guidelines that we're provided with by state and federal.
Understandable. And then when you say low-income folks, are you describing those that fall below that 120 median income, or what? How are we defining low-income folks?
For the state of Florida, the money that we receive from the state government, we can assist up to 120% population, people that don't exceed that. For the federal government, it's 80% or less. So if someone is going to occupy an ADU unit, that income cannot go over those limits. The rent, we have to follow their maximum rent guidelines and all the other requirements. And this is on an annual basis.
Thank you.
Do we know how many we monitor? Just, I don't know if you know, off the top of your head, how many we currently monitor?
I want to say 18 projects right now. And within that 18 projects, we have like 20 units. So it's my responsibility to do so. So I have to call the agent, the project manager to say, okay, I'm available at this time, and either I go to the property, I get one of the city staff to do the physical inspection, because the property has to be up to a certain code. If there's something going on where there's a roof leak or the smoke detectors are not placed in the proper area, then they have to make sure that's corrected. And we find that to be a challenge, especially when you go into a private home and you try to tell folks how to manage the property.
Do they have to go through a full HQS inspection or just?
For the SHIP program, it's not as restrictive. For the federal program, yes, they have to follow the HQS standards.
And every year, an HQS is done?
And this monitoring is done only if they are using those funds and
Correct.
resources that you're describing?
Correct. Only
So if
they're
I
gonna-
built my own ADU that was city approved without funding,
Then
you wouldn't be monitoring?
you won't
or
be
need-
impacted, yeah.
Appreciate it, thank you.
Unless, of course, Carrie, correct me if I'm wrong, you're doing a rehabilitation on that unit, for example, then it would apply.
It would apply because it's a rental it's considered a rent, you're using a rental strategy.
Correct.
Thank you. I'm sorry to take us down this path.
No, please.
I apologize.
No, this is a
That's
great
what we're here for.
conversation. Yeah, this is really good. All right.
So the relationship to the ADU strategy and the use of federal and state funds, do we have to ask the question as to what is the consequence to staff and timing to fully monitor that as part of this document, or is that just an ongoing statement and direction that staff and community development would have to?
I think in the context of units that are using state or federal funding, I think to get that funding, the monitoring would have to take place, and that's something that's going to occur just through the application for the funding. I don't know if that necessarily needs to be a strategy in here, but I think some of the other topics that were brought up today regarding perhaps education about accessory dwelling units, how to get an accessory dwelling unit permitted, things like that, I think very much fall under an incentive, so to speak, for this particular planning document. In terms of the conversation that was just had, any ideas about incentives that you would like to add? I can go through the incentives that are perhaps in here, because we haven't quite gotten to that yet, regarding accessory dwelling units, and then maybe after we look at the ones that you already have, then we can talk about maybe adjusting those or adding some other incentives to promote ADUs. I think this is an important one to pause on, because I know this was brought up at our first meeting and our second meeting, and I think we've had probably the most discussion about this particular topic, along with partnerships, which we'll get to in a moment. So let me go through. So the first one that is already in the LHIS document is to continue to allow for accessory dwelling units in non-residential zoning districts as described within the city's community development code. That's already in there, and the recommendation was from October 28th was to continue that. So I think I see nods from everyone regarding that incentive. 5.2 is to implement the City Council comprehensive plan policies to allow accessory dwelling units by providing corresponding standards in the community development code. That was done, so those standards are in there, and the recommendation from October 28th was just to continue that. Provide flexibility for other alternative unit types, such as co-housing, to incentivize unconventional solutions to address affordable housing needs and support aging in place within existing neighborhoods. This is one that is in progress and is not yet in the community development code, so the recommendation from our last meeting was just to continue this, so that city staff continues to look at that. Okay, all right.
Chair, I have a question. We've got ADUs, which basically are two dwelling units on one parcel. What is the difference between that as far as funding and incentives to a duplex or a triplex?
Yeah, so so the accessory dwelling units are in addition to a single family home. So that would be in another unit, smaller unit in a rear yard or something like that, in addition to a single family home, which is different from a triplex or duplex or a quadplex. It's a different detached, smaller structure on primarily a single family residential lot. Yeah.
I understand that, but
yeah.
I'm talking about the principle of funding the incentive.
Okay.
Could it be applied to those purchasing or a duplex or a triplex and keeping it affordable, the other two units? What's the difference? You know, could that apply or not apply? That's just a thought.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. Yeah, the funding mechanism perhaps is the same among unit types, because regardless, you're funding a homeowner unit or a rental unit per se. So, so for this one's still in progress. So 5.3, and then that's the end of the accessory dwelling units. So in addition, did we want to discuss modifying any of these, 5.1, 5.2, or 5.3, or adding another accessory dwelling unit recommendation? I know some of the topics that were brought up were the education, and then I think we had discussed rental rebates and some other strategies as well during the first meeting. Yes, go ahead. Yeah.
Well, I think we're addressing some of the barriers and just, impact fees, assisting in streamlining that process. How do we handle the hookup of water, sewer, utility? Is that considered a total separate unit? Is it, does the city help in connecting it to that residential house? I know those can be expensive. Are there ways to help with those fees? I think something I read through one of these incentive programs was It costs a homeowner over $1,700 in just that permitting and review process alone for it. So what do we do as a city to incentivize that? Those might be some of the opportunities.
Okay, so possibly a recommendation would be regarding considering financial incentives for ADUs in terms of supporting the development of them through financing, not necessarily code allowance, which I think is what the majority of the recommendations currently cover, which is getting it allowable by land development code or community development code. But now we're discussing perhaps financial incentives for ADUs and then education about ADUs as well. Anything else?
Well,
Yeah.
just to clear on my stance, not necessarily saying, do we need to use, tax dollars to necessarily fund these? That's not the direction I was going, but in how we handle those fees associated is different than spending our tax dollars to incentivize it.
Okay.
Just to be clear. Thank you.
But so to look at something that Ms. Mayu said earlier in terms of the impact fees of hooking things up and things like that, you said that there is about $260,000 available and only $7,500 has been used. So perhaps that's a pot of money. I don't know if that may be a pot of money that can be used towards these incentives.
I would have to look at the source of that funding, but that could also require that they have that land use restriction agreement, depending on the type of funding, and then also, that monitoring could come into place. We'll have to look into it, but yeah, not a bad suggestion.
Should we add as, we were talking about state and federal funding and kind of some onerous or burdensome tasks that are tied to that funding that really are just not sustainable so when we talk about education, which I thought that was a great idea, right? Obviously, we were at a college, but I think the education piece is integral. I do think we don't want to educate people on a source of funding that's just going to cause us more issues, right? Like, we don't want to say there's a state and federal pot of money and then suddenly we have all of this and we can't support it because the strings attached to be able to maintain it or check on it is just too burdensome. So I don't know if that falls into like a barrier or it falls into when we start looking at what funding is available when we educate, we have to be really discerning about what we're promoting. We don't want to put something out there that we just can't handle.
It's imperative to create program guidelines that apply to accessory dwellings. Who builds them? Where are they built? Can a homeowner apply for construction loan to build an ADU if they agree to rent it affordably? And what percent of the area median income would that homeowner have to be? So there's a lot of thought that has to go into creating program guidelines to identify all the questions that someone coming to an educational seminar may ask.
I think there's a couple of things that are important to recognize. One underlying philosophy is density, and that is something that's consistent throughout what we're trying to do in a built-out area. The other one is the presence of small projects. North Greenwood is built out. Other neighborhoods in the city of Clearwater are built out. And so we are left with, in some sense, we are left with small projects, which create an obstacle for costs, which create an obstacle for monitoring. And I think in some way that education combined with the fact of trying to add density to already an existing community, and then the implications of being focusing on small projects, all combine that this does need to be addressed, whether that be with education, not only with the community, but also with developers, to understand how does this work, what impact does it have throughout the life of the project, including the monitoring aspect of that. And so all of those factors have to be included in that.
I would say, just for a resource, if people are interested, the Florida Housing Coalition does put an ADU guidebook out that covers a lot of those very things that you're discussing. It's about 60 pages, but it is a worthwhile read if anybody's interested.
I think it's available online also. Membership of Florida Housing Coalition, I think.
All right. So with that, at our next meeting on December 3rd, I'll come back with some potential recommendation language for this particular incentive area, the accessory dwelling units, based on the discussion today. And then maybe we can continue that discussion on December 3rd regarding whether or not to incorporate that additional language. So anything else on ADUs before we jump to the next incentive area? Okay, all right. So the next incentive area was parking reductions. 6.1 was to continue to allow flexible setback requirements for affordable housing developments. The direction was to continue that incentive. Okay. 6.2 is continue to tie reductions of off-street parking requirements to proximity and access to alternative modes of transportation, including transit, sidewalks, trails, and other options. This is currently in the city's community development code. So I think at our last meeting we discussed continuing it. All right, and then switching to another incentive area. So this is number 7, flexible lot configurations. The previous recommendation was 7.1, continue to allow flexible lot configurations for affordable housing developments while remaining sensitive to the character and context of existing neighborhoods. The October 28th direction was to continue that as well. Modification of street requirements. This is another one where there was a recommendation of no recommendation. So because such standards are in place to benefit public health and safety, we do not recommend that the city utilize the modification of street requirements as an incentive for affordable housing. Okay. All right, so that one's continued as well. 9 is pre-adoption policy consideration. 9.1 was, as part of its annual reporting, the Economic Development and Housing Department will continue to review all regulations and ordinances that may affect the cost of housing. Recommendation was to continue. All right, pre-adoption policy consideration again, number 9. 9.2, continue the review process maintained by the senior executive team through which any new regulatory instrument created in the city, so for example, ordinances, regulations, etc., or by related state legislation can be evaluated for its effect on housing affordability. And the direction from October 28th was to continue that as well. Moving on to 10, inventory of public lands. This is another area that was discussed both on September 10th and October 28th. The discussion was that the current incentives make sense, but there may be a need for additional education about the code enforcement as incentive. Coordination with code enforcement has occurred, however, no specific projects have resulted. The committee requested further discussion of recommendation 10.4 and items for follow-up or whether there is a specific agreement with code enforcement for information sharing. And then I believe the committee also asked about the scoring matrix for lot disposition and the city's lot disposition policy.
Yeah, so there isn't a specific agreement with code enforcement for information sharing. However, we have connected earlier this year with code enforcement to pull a total list of all of the properties with fines on them currently, or fines that are building. And we did send out letters to those homeowners, to ones that were homesteaded, single-family homes that we could assist with our rehabilitation program. So though we don't have a specific agreement, we do work with them. And then the scoring matrix, we do have a scoring matrix for lot disposition, and I can send that out to the committee after this meeting.
I might have missed that last. What exactly is code enforcement incentive?
Yeah, let me. I'll go on to that incentive. So here, let me. These are the incentives related to inventory of public lands, and I'll jump forward to the one about the code enforcement, which was 10.4, and then I'll go back to the other previous ones under 10. So 10.4 that was discussed at the last meeting was related to properties having repeat code enforcement violations, and the recommendation of the previous committee was the Economic Development and Housing Department will coordinate with the Planning and Development Department to identify properties having repeat code violations that may be suitable for rehabilitation, acquisition, or demolition for affordable housing. And so the discussion at the last meeting surrounded whether or not that has been done and to what extent, and as Dylan just stated, letters did go out, and city staff has been trying to facilitate that, but there hasn't been any real response, I guess, from that program or that outreach initiative.
And then who would we expect to respond? A homeowner that's letting their property dilapidate?
Yeah, the incentive basically was that, the city has a program for housing rehabilitation. This is how we can help you with these funds that are available, these grant funds that are available. This is how we can help you rehabilitate your property, and we're happy to help you walk you through that process. I believe that was the outreach that occurred.
And then how would we as a city handle if there's an existing $188,000 in code fines?
Mm-hmm.
So we assess fines, but then we're also gonna give money out of the other hand to incentivize the property to come into compliance? How does that?
Yeah, and there are some properties with that amount on them. Unfortunately, if there's a lien or a potential judgment that's going to go on the property, we're not going to close a rehabilitation loan on that. That's per our legal team, so.
I would have.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Chair, does the city have a code enforcement board?
Yes.
And does the code enforcement board identify the liens that creates the judgment?
Yeah, so the code enforcement board meets monthly to review these properties with these active code violations. They work with the property owner, and then the lien is actually recorded after so many steps have been taken, and they issue the order.
So if
And
someone
they do receive they do receive a quarterly statement regarding those liens and the fines accruing on their property. So the property owner is advised from the moment that the lien is recorded and how those fines are accruing.
So if the code enforcement board was advised by the code enforcement officer that homeowner had applied for rehabilitation, and the rehabilitation is approved and completed, would the code enforcement board waive the lien?
That would be a question between the actual property, depending on the situation, so that it would be at this point, I would say if a lien is issued and there is attempt and legal comes up with an agreement between the property owner and with code enforcement that they come up to let's rehab, and they're able to minimize. But when it comes down to a property where you have $180,000, let's say the property value is $150,000, that will not necessarily be realistic.
No, that in that case it would not be realistic. But if you have a roof replacement and they've got a tarp on it and they can't afford it and so forth, and we go in and they get fined.
They do work with staff, and so I'll let Gina handle that.
Good morning, Gina Clayton, Planning and Development. I just wanted to say if a property owner was in the enforcement process and we knew that they were working with economic development and housing to get the loan in place, we probably wouldn't be taking the case to code board because we'd be trying to resolve it with that assistance. So in those cases, those probably won't get to code board unless something falls apart and that doesn't work.
Is there any kind of forgiveness plan if they bring it up to code, or any incentive to use the down payment?
Well, there would not be a lien on the property unless code board assessed the lien after repeated attempts to get compliance and they didn't come into compliance. So I think there's two scenarios that you're talking about. One is before you get to code board, and then one if you have liens. It's up to the code board to reduce any liens, and if they don't agree to reduce it, then they would be obligated to pay.
Thank you. Obviously, I did chair that board for several years, and you're exactly correct. There is a history of our code boards in the past that they do have a compassion or sensitivity in them, that if an owner is showing that they are communicating and working with in cooperation, those liens have been reduced. I do still think normally an administrative cost is still attached to it that they pay, but it's often far, far, far less than the astronomical fee that can be there.
I just know the public is a little difficult sometimes, and they don't like to apply for rehabilitation loans and so forth, so they put up a barrier. You know, we have to convince them that this is to their benefit, you know, so there's got to be some mediation between the departments. Again, it gets back to education. When they understand what we're trying to do to help them, they're a little reluctant sometimes to come forward and comply.
Additionally, Ms. Clayton's group did put a dashboard together regarding this. It is on our city website, so anybody can go on and track all of our code enforcement issues throughout the city live. Yeah.
All right, so returning to recommendation 10.4, are there any modifications after discussion today that we want to make to this recommendation? I think that's where we left off last meeting, was potentially revising this to make perhaps either make it more effective or some other modification to this. Any ideas?
I mean, not to keep jumping in, I think it's important, obviously, to have it on paper, but I don't think there's many examples of where we've actually, as a city, moved forward with this. And while it sounds great, that repeat code of problems or challenges in our city, and they dilapidate, and the community gets upset and writes about them and calls and shows up to meetings, and it circles through the process at all of our code board hearings, whether they're suitable for rehabilitation, acquisition, or demolition. I don't know of too many scenarios where we've moved forward with that.
I think because of the nature of how unique every single case is, I don't know how we can be more specific at this point in time. By case in point, though, I do want to highlight the fact that in the past we have, as a purchaser, we have had an excellent working relationship both with the planning department and code enforcement to address properties that have had multiple code violations. We've been able to step in, present a reasonable offer to purchase, and the enforcement department, for example, in the last one, the enforcement department was ready to take the citation to the enforcement board, and when the enforcement officer found out we were trying to purchase this property for affordable housing, they deferred the agenda for us to be able to close, pull our demo permit, and remove the blight. And so with that effort being active in trying to improve the community, it really works from that perspective. But like I said, every case is so unique, and every interaction with the humanity of a case like that is very, very sensitive. And so I think it's important that this stay on there, but I don't know if there's a specific formula that allows it, that'll work in any consistent manner just because of the uniqueness of the case.
So what I'm hearing is to keep the recommendation so that it's noted and that the ethos of the recommendation is there. The city will continue to look for opportunities to coordinate in this regard, but perhaps at this time there's really not a more specific recommendation that can be added to this. For now, it's just documenting the intent to keep continuing to try to move this forward. So, all right, very good. So I'm going to actually go backward. So we jumped to 10.4. 10.1 was that the Economic Development and Housing Department will continue to maintain the inventory of publicly owned land suitable for the development of affordable housing. As I believe all of you know, there is an inventory online. I think we've discussed it at the previous meetings. I think we discussed there's about 30 now, I think maybe, just 30 properties on that list. So the city does maintain that. So the recommendation was to continue with that list. So I'm seeing nods there. And then 10.2 is continue to publish that inventory on the city's website and also link to Pinellas County's inventory so that prospective developers and nonprofit agencies can actually view the list. All right, I'm seeing nods on that one. And then point 2 was to continue to make publicly owned land available to prospective developers or non-profit agencies for developing affordable housing. And then that's where we branched off into that discussion of the city's lot disposition policy and the criteria matrix for that. So that gets us through recommendations 10.1 through 10.3. And then 10.4, we're keeping that recommendation also as is. So, all right. Everybody comfortable to move on from the inventory? Okay. All right. So, there's one more. 10.5, continue to monitor the policy procedure for distribution of city-owned lots. Again, this is the lot disposition procedure, and then the scoring matrix. So that's where we discussed that as well. Any other comments about this?
I'm curious about the list.
Yeah.
There's 30 lands available on the list. How were those lands acquired by the city?
So it's a blend. Some of them have been on the cities, have been an asset of the cities for years, and some of them were obtained through like tax liens, or they were purchased by the city potentially for the redevelopment, either affordable housing or economic development.
And out of those, how many, an estimate of how many, what are the barriers that they're not moving, they're not being sold or taken over or developed or?
Well, the ones that are left are we no longer have any more single-family home lots. They're all either combined lots, commercial. So at this point, they're all multifamily, and a lot of them are on the MLK corridor. And so we really haven't had the demand or interest yet.
I got you.
So 10.5 is just really about implementing the lot disposition policy. Is everybody okay with that? So 11, so this is the last required incentive area in terms of the list that the AHAC is required to review. Recommendation 11.1 was that the city will maintain and implement policies of the city's comprehensive plan that incentivize affordable housing development proximate to transportation hubs, major employment centers, and mixed-use developments. The recent comprehensive plan amendments incorporate these policies, so those are in there currently. So the recommendation was to continue. Okay. Adaptive reuse. So now we're moving into the incentive areas that were added. So recommendation 12.1 was to continue to allow and promote adaptive reuse involving the conversion of surplus and or outmoded buildings, including old churches, school buildings, hospitals, train stations, warehouses, factories, hotels, office buildings, malls, etc., to mixed uses where permitted by zoning district or by the Live Local Act. Okay, seeing no discussion, moving on. 13 was regarding the Land Development Code. 13.1 is to continue to incentivize developers to address recommended design standards for affordable housing developments, consistent with Section 3-920 of the City of Clearwater Community Development Code. Other criteria could include, but are not limited to, providing direct and visual access to open space for residents, considering play areas when developing family housing, providing nighttime outdoor illumination for safety, using landscape standards and buffers to screen nuisances and to separate public and private areas, centrally locate common facilities, use crime prevention through environmental design when practical and financially feasible, and include electric vehicle charging infrastructure. And the October 28th direction was to continue that. Communication and marketing of affordable housing. So we talked about this on October 28th. We talked about how the education about the city's housing programs is important. At that time, the committee requested to add an incentive regarding partnerships with lenders, realtors, title companies, inspectors as they relate to purchase of real estate and down payment closing cost assistance. At the conclusion of that discussion, the committee deferred that to recommendation 16.1, so moving that discussion from 14 to 16. And then contractors should have the opportunity to bid projects through a city-approved list to facilitate assistance. Again, deferred to recommendation 16. So recommendation 14.1, and there were no changes to these, were to continue to improve current communication channels and marketing materials to reach different stakeholders interested in affordable housing. Some of the suggested actions include, but are not limited to, conducting an educational campaign in conjunction with regular city communications to to rebrand affordable housing as workforce housing that supports the diverse needs of residents through a variety of unit product types compatible with the city's neighborhoods. Partnering with Amplify Clearwater and others to broadly promote the benefits of and opportunities for affordable housing development in the city and to communicate successes. Prepare, update, and keep current marketing materials for the general public in order to promote the different housing programs that the city offers, including homebuyer education and down payment assistance to support home ownership. Prepare, update, and keep current marketing materials that help developers and the general public understand application criteria, permitting processes, and the number of incentives available for rehabilitation and new construction of affordable housing units in the city. And to that particular bullet, if you recall, a brochure was produced and some other measures to help further market that. Make accessible to the public an inventory and a map of suitable residential vacant land available for development. Include a section on the city's website called Affordable Housing and Community Development. And share outcomes and analytics with appropriate city boards and committees. City staff is doing all of these to some degree, and the recommendation was to continue this particular one. Yes?
I think the most important thing we get in the mail that comes with the water bill is the sunshine bond.
Yeah, okay.
That's a great tool for promoting our programs, not just our programs, but citywide.
Yeah.
I want to compliment the city for that.
Yeah, so, yeah, good. All right, financing. So 15 is a topic of financing. The summary of the discussion from the previous two meetings was the high cost of rent and utilities leaves no option for living in the city. The lack of affordability is pushing residents out of the city and creates disadvantages due to limited access to transportation. So, for example, bus and transit systems, opportunities to get to work are diminished. There's a brain drain effect for younger residents just graduating. I think we talked about this mostly at the first meeting. And then further discussion regarding coordination with code enforcement related incentives. That was that recommendation 10.4. We talked about that. And that being a strategy to create more livable units and more affordable units inside the city. So with go ahead. Yeah.
Sure, do you mind that? The first one just caught me, and I'm sorry. The high cost of rent utilities leaves no option for living in the city.
That was the discussion from the first one.
Yeah, that just seems a little harsh to go in that direction. I know it's a challenge for our entire region and communities, and it is definitely a burden, but leaves no option for living in the city. That's a bit of a tough question.
Limited options for living in the city. So yeah, we can revise that.
And the word limited totally changes that sentence.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Sure.
Definitely agree.
Yeah. Yeah. So we'll I'm not sure that language is specifically in the report, but I'll look for it to see if it's in there. Let's see. So recommendation 15.1 was diversify financial strategies to contribute to the new construction and maintenance of affordable housing and financial assistance to obtain affordable housing. So this is an aspirational recommendation, just really to continue to look for as many financial strategies as possible. Recommendation 5.2, evaluate the feasibility of reducing paying code violation liens on lots suitable for affordable housing development. This stems back to the 10.4, recommendation 10.4 discussion we just had. After that discussion, any modifications to this one, which is under financing?
Just another question about wording, and what struck me in going through 14 and now 15 was, the first in 14.1, the first bullet point talked about changing language from affordable housing to workforce housing. And then here in 15, everything is referencing affordable housing. Is there a question of consistency in language that we need to talk about in this, or is it fine the way it is?
That's a good conversation to have. So, from the local housing incentive strategy report standpoint, we're talking about affordable housing. That's what the statute is requiring us to look at from SHIP. But with that said, I think what the recommendations are getting towards is outwardly facing when you're communicating with the community to shift that brand from affordable housing to workforce housing, because I think what past committees have tried to reinforce is that there's a certain stigma or perspective of affordable housing that isn't necessarily helpful to getting affordable housing developments approved. And if you can frame it in the context of workforce housing, which it is, if you frame it in that context, it really provides more of an incentive for support of that particular project. So I think that's what that's getting at. Regarding rebranding it throughout the whole document, I think we're probably sticking to the nomenclature that's in the statute of what the committee's required to look at. But I think that where we refer to it in here from a marketing standpoint, perhaps we should steer it over to workforce housing. Does that make sense, or does that help answer your question?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, I agree with you. Thank you for bringing it up. A lot of our communities are also shifting another degree away from that, from workforce, and using the word obtainable.
Right.
Right, because workforce kind of puts a picture in our mind that we're just taking care of workers when, we do have young and we do have elderly and we do have disabled who may not be working that need obtainable homes as well.
Yeah.
Obtainable and sustainable too.
There you go.
Yeah. That leads to the question then, in some of these places where we are referring to it as workforce housing, do we want to add that attainable housing language this committee rounds to that? Shifting away from even workforce and going towards attainable now, or workforce and attainable.
Workforce and attainable.
I'm sorry?
I said I like workforce and attainable.
And attainable.
I do like the addition of attainable. We use workforce a lot, maybe in just being education sphere. We use workforce a lot, and it's not always intuitive what workforce means. In certain industry, workforce means certification. In certain industries, I agree. It gives this connotation that it's just we're housing the workers. I like workforce. I think is going to be attractive to some people, but I really do like the addition of obtainable. I like that we're moving towards that. But really on point with shifting away from affordable. I agree. There's a real stigma there, and it limits how many people are actually looking for it. That's a really good point.
So I'll go through and look at particularly the ones related to rebranding and changing how we refer to affordable housing, and see where we can start adding attainable in there as well. So let's see. I think we got through this one. So we went back to 10.4 for that conversation, diversifying financial strategies, and then talking about evaluating the feasibility of reducing paying code violation liens on lots suitable for affordable housing development. I think we left off any changes to this, or just leave it as is, like 10.4. I'm not hearing anything, so we'll just continue it. Okay, all right, very good. 15.3 was ensure city staffing levels are adequate to achieve the AHAC recommendations of the LHIS report. No change last time. Okay, all right. All right, so partnerships. So this was a big one. So on October 28th, we talked about, actually starting on September 10th, excuse me, third-party barriers continue to affect housing affordability. We talked about that. We talked about rent, mortgage, and interest rates, closing costs, inspection and processing fees, and insurance premiums, and how all of those are third-party barriers to affordability. We talked about strategies to maximize residents' buying power, so things like interest rate buy-down or down payment assistance strategies, real estate tax reductions, or other tax mechanisms. We talked about equity to third-party mortgages due on sale, for example, non-conforming mortgages or industry things that perhaps may not be currently acceptable in the industry, but what are some other options or some progressive tools. And then talked about how partnerships are necessary to address third-party barriers. So those are the things we talked about on September 10th. Anything to add to that discussion? Okay. All right. And then so on October 28th, we talked about the need to incentivize, or essentially a need for an incentive regarding partnerships with lenders, realtors, title companies, inspectors, et cetera, as they relate to the purchase of real estate and down payment closing cost assistance. We talked about how contractors should have the opportunity to bid projects through a city-approved list to facilitate assistance. And we talked about the need to improve consistency between qualification criteria among entitlement grantees in the region. And those were the items from October 28th regarding partnerships specifically. So for 16.1, the first part of that was develop public and private partnerships for the provision of affordable housing. So prepare, advertise, and maintain an inventory of affordable housing providers, developers, and any other related organization. Encourage partnerships between current and new affordable housing developers for mentoring and technical training. Establish partnerships with major employers to coordinate the supply of workforce housing. Encourage and support joint development opportunities between the private sector and nonprofits to develop affordable housing. Engage lenders in training and ongoing discussions with the city relative to underwriting and credit standards, technology solutions, as well as the development of financial products in an effort to maximize the financing options available to first-time home buyers through conventional and other lenders. I think that last bullet addresses some of the conversations that we had on September 10th. And then here we're proposing some alternative language. So coordinate with Pinellas County joint programs for the provision of affordable housing, including the Pinellas County countywide strategy, Advantage Pinellas Housing Compact, and then at our last meeting we talked about adding the Pinellas Housing Finance Authority. Is everybody okay with that modification? Okay. All right, we added a new bullet here, coordinate with other entitlement grantees in the region to improve consistency as feasible between qualification criteria for housing assistance programs. Everybody's okay. Monitor and encourage citizens to lobby for the development of statewide legislation initiatives to gauge the local impact of their provisions. Okay. And then another new bullet here, partner with lenders, realtors, title companies, inspectors, and contractors through regular outreach meetings to improve knowledge of the city's housing assistance programs and facilitate opportunities for qualified contractors to bid projects. Great. And then coordinate with the private sector and nonprofits to provide home buyer education, home warranties, and other strategies that reduce the ongoing maintenance risk of home ownership. So that was, let's see, and then we have a few more here. Increase down payment assistance loan amounts to be viable for the homeowner while remaining financially feasible for the continued operation of the city's program. Improve the timing of housing quality standards inspections to facilitate closings on homes with down payment assistance loans if feasible under funding source requirements. And partner with the private sector and nonprofits to address third-party barriers to affordable housing and to identify appropriate incentives to reduce labor and material costs for developers and long-term maintenance, operational and insurance costs for homeowners. And that concludes recommendation 16.1. So the October 28th direction was to modify, and that was on the previous slide, those additional bullets and some language was added there. Is everybody comfortable with how this recommendation looks now? Okay, all right.
You mentioned that the housing, they changed their name on Overton, the Realtor Organization.
Well, it just talks about realtors. It doesn't.
It
talk
doesn't
about,
say specifically.
Doesn't say specifically pro or what's it called now?
I don't know,
Tampa
merge
Realtors.
basically with Hillsborough County, so we're all one.
Yeah, it's.
Oh, so it's regional now?
Yes, it's Tampa, it's Hillsborough County, Pinellas County, and Central Pasco. They're all.
Is it GTAR? Is it Greater Tampa Bay Association of Realtors?
No, that was.
That's
Oh,
what
that was
Hillsborough.
And
Okay.
then we're, okay.
I think isn't it like Tampa Bay Realtors or something like that?
Something. It's a new change.
Okay.
It's just a great place for an opportunity for education.
Or I was thinking some jurisdictions, sorry, I keep backing from this. Some jurisdictions have actually a list of approved lenders, realtors, and things like that, and how they do their lists. Realtors or lenders have to sit through a training, and once you have that training, then you're on that list. It's, I think, also an incentive sometimes for a realtor or lender to take the class and take the education, because then they're on this list, and those lists are put on the city websites or county websites as well, and that could be something that Clearwater looks at doing. I think it's helpful because then you're getting realtors, lenders, and I don't know about the title company inspectors, but I think it gives them the information and knowledge of the program when they're assisting people in these things. So I think more than just saying partner, how are we going to partner? You know, and what kind of programs partnerships are we gonna have and what's really gonna draw these partners in.
And while some of the jurisdictions, there are actually very few anymore who have these presentations in person, a lot of them now create either a video or a PowerPoint that the partner has to go through and then answer questions. And once you've done that and send the results to the city or the county, you're on their list.
And you're back on their list. Yeah. Because it's a great program, but then some were restricted. You had to be on the list for that buyer to use their program. Pasco County was one in general. And that became cumbersome because if you're working with a buyer and you're not on the list and then you couldn't take the class, but now you can do it all virtually. So if you have a buyer that's looking at Pasco, you can go and sit through their class and then you send an email. But I think it definitely has people representing people in the city that actually understand the programs and has more knowledge that they're not getting buyers in a situation that isn't a home that actually works with the city's program.
Do we, with that conversation, do we want to add more specific language in here about training or specifically a list? I know we talked about a list last time. We kind of left this more broad, this particular bullet, but do we want to be more specific with that? It's up to the committee.
This would be maintaining a list of realtors and things like that. Is that what we're?
Yeah, and I also defer to city staff as well as whether that's something city staff would be, amenable to, because that's something that has to obviously be maintained and facilitated too. So
somebody's got to make sure the list is right.
Right.
So we have to go.
Yep.
Dr. Perez, so you're in reference to what you're discussing about the list. How would that work specifically? Because when you're working with people that are receiving down payment assistance, we don't control who they're using, and we don't want to limit people to having to use specific people to service them, because we don't want to take away from other people who might be using the down payment assistance that want to come in and feel like now they have to go to someone else and have this conversation. Sorry, realtor, I can't work with you.
So the way Pasco County does it, that's probably the best example, is if I'm a buyer and I'm using Lindsay as a realtor, and Lindsay's not on Pasco County's list, but I want to use Lindsay as my realtor, she can, at any time during the transaction before closing, take the online training and now get on the list. So you don't have to change your realtor or your lender. They can do it anytime during the transaction.
And that was an updated change. It was
Yes.
before you used to have to go sit in person and take the classes annually, or how, I think it was
Every 2 years.
Yeah, 2 years. You would have to do it, and since it has been changed, so it doesn't make somebody have to switch who they're using, but it also makes that partner understand the program.
Yeah, we would definitely have to look at, I know with CDBG, they have certain regulations, of course, when it comes to lists. So we would have to really research that and make sure we're, depending on the source of funding, that we are following the regulations on what we're supposed to be doing.
I think language that would be training or orientation, how to close a DPA loan, that the team, the buyer's team, would have to sit through would be very, very valuable. There tend to be, for the uninitiated, there tend to be a lot of mistakes that come through during the DPA closing that can potentially be harmful to the buyer as well as the seller. And so if that process would be included, I think it could be beneficial for streamlining the closing process.
I think it also helps your realtors and lenders that maybe don't know about the program, or once they do take that course, and sometimes they can't be introduced to it literally from having a buyer, then they're gonna get more information and be better able to serve more people. You would be surprised how many realtors don't know about down
And
payment
lenders.
assistance programs and lenders. Yeah, absolutely. So.
I have a
Finally,
question.
interview. Go ahead.
David, I'm not sure where you're going with your question. I kind of got lost because we have an extensive manual. We have partners that provide the processing. They do the coordination of between the different partners for us. So if there's a problem with the partners that are providing the assistance, then we need to know this so we can educate them. We can provide them again with the manual and take them step by step through the process that we could do ourselves. But again, they're professional. We're paying them for this, so we need to know if a partner is not, if they're not, doing the processing at a certain standard, then guidance need to be provided.
I agree with you. What I think is happening is that the buyer's representatives aren't paying attention to that manual and following that manual, and as a result, a lot of times things are happening that shouldn't be happening. And so to just strengthen, whether that be reading the manual from the buyer's team, to verify that that has happened, I think gives your contractors that are administering the down payment assistance program a little bit more teeth to make sure that those steps and that information is actually read and followed through on.
Yeah, so I think the step that we need to take is to reach out to, the providers, the folks that we're working with that's out there in our spot, find out where the challenges are. For example, as a lender, if you have a problem with the processor, let us know so that we can use that as a tool to better what we do.
So I will say that usually in working with your professional, your partners, they are really good at telling us as a lender this is what we need, this is what is happening, this is where we are in the process. I think what happens is you have lenders and realtors who think they know what they're doing and they don't listen to your partners. And they say,
no requirement of education.
right, and we've never done it that way before. Well, you're now getting down payment assistance, this is how you have to do it.
Yeah.
And they don't, and I think there may even be some lenders and realtors who don't realize that they have to go through the partner, that they may want to go, and maybe they call you and you say, contact one of the partners. I just happen to know that I have to go through one of the partners.
Yeah, I think we can improve that by, if there's a new lender, because we don't want to limit the program to say you have to be a lender's list or a realtor's list, but I think that we can do better by saying if you're a new lender, here's our manual.
Yes.
Read the manual, and if you have any questions or concerns, then you can always reach out to staff and we can provide you with guidance. I think that would be an approach that would, help all parties.
Yeah,
But not to limit it.
And obviously every jurisdiction does it differently. City of St. Petersburg, they had a huge turnover in staff. We all know this. And since that turnover, they've had just meetings quarterly with lenders, with some realtors, just to go over their program. So that's one way to do it. Pasco County, City of Tampa, Manatee County, they send out their training and you have to take their training and be on their list. St. Pete does not have a list. Pinellas County does not have a list. City of Largo does not have a list, but so we all do it differently, right? And it's just, one thought that to make sure that any lender and realtor who are looking to use the program at least read through the manual, right? Send them the manual and let them read through it, and if they have any questions, call the partner to see, to get those questions answered.
Dylan, that's probably a step that we could take to enhance
Yeah.
the program. Thank you.
All right. So with that particular recommendation bullet, I'm hearing maybe add training specifically or education specifically into that, but not necessarily a list. That's kind of the summary at the end of that I got. Yeah.
Providing guidelines.
Providing guidelines specifically to that. So, okay. So we'll provide some revision to that particular bullet for the next meeting. So anything else on the topic of partnerships? Sorry, getting down to the last one. Anything? Okay. All right. Before I go on to our discussion of our next meeting, I want to make sure that everybody received the meeting materials for today's meeting. In that, you should have received a draft of the 2024 Local Housing Incentive Strategy Report. That draft is updated to the date that it went out, which was about a week ago. So please read that between now and our next meeting if you haven't had a chance to do that yet. As we discussed today, there will be some additional revisions presented at the next meeting to address the conversation today. But the bulk of the draft report is here for you. So this is the report that will go forward to City Council and then ultimately be attached to that local housing assistance plan in the end. So just please keep your eye on that report since that's the actual document that would move forward. So for our next meeting is on December 3rd and it will be held as a public hearing. Florida statute requires that the last meeting of the AHAC be held as a public hearing. So just note that there'll be opportunity for public comment at that particular meeting. Additionally, I'll bring back, as I mentioned, some revised language for discussion. At the end of that meeting, then the committee will be asked to make a recommendation to the City Council by forwarding those recommendations on to the Council. So I'm just giving you a heads up on that. And with that, if you have any questions, feel free to contact city staff between now and December 3rd. So, okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Does anyone from the public wish to speak on this item? If so, please step to the podium and you will have 3 minutes to speak. Please make sure you state your name and spell your last name for the clerk.
I'm Mr. Haluba. Everybody knows how to spell my last name. I've sat through this for an hour and a half, and it's just, another eye-opener for me. I'm going to throw a little cold water on all of this. I don't think, honestly, that it's the city's business to be involved in affordable housing. I think there's a lot of, word salad and jibber jabber that went on this last hour and a half. Can't decide if it's workforce housing, can't decide if it's affordable housing, can't decide if it's obtainable housing. I would say that, all of it's attainable. I will float, one thing that I think will solve it. And what a lot of people do to afford, to buy a house or buy real estate or anything else. Many people have done it. I have. I worked 2 jobs so that I could buy a house. There wasn't any of this business. This is overt government overreach that's totally unnecessary. All you have to do is look at the bullet points, Some of them don't even make any sense. They literally do not make any sense. I like the one about specific parameters for flexibility. Well, I don't know what that means, and from looking at your faces, most of you don't know what it means either. And I heard something about, seniors aging in place. Well, I'm a senior, and I'm having a little trouble aging in place because of the utility fees, which were mentioned. They've gone up, each one of them a minimum of 3% and the most at 8%, which I've mentioned before. The 8% is for stormwater. Stormwater is not a utility. Storm surge is not a utility. Ask the residents of North Beach. The city of Clearwater does not allow you to pick and choose which utilities you want. So in that regard, it kind of acts like a, it's forced. It's organized crime.
Thank you. Is there anyone else from the public who wishes to speak on this? Ms. Call, do we have any comments by email? I will now close the public comment period. Is there anyone here to speak on items not on today's agenda? If so, please step to the podium, state your name and spell your last name for the record. You have 3 minutes to speak on a subject that is not on today's agenda.
I'm Mr. Haluba again. I'll try to make this brief. I have a problem with a lot of things that are going on in the city of Clearwater. I think there is a lack of management expertise. I think the city manager got her job, by default. And rather than going through the city charter, which calls for a nationwide search, she was, coronated in that position. The city council continues to hold her up as a wonderful manager, giving her 7.5% raise, Mr. Menino. But there's nothing specific about what's going on with that management that is so wonderful. Let me tell you a couple things that aren't. The police department. Ms. Poirier is responsible for the police department. It's the same police department that's had 3 Clearwater police officers arrested this year. I don't know how it gets much worse than the police department tipping off drug dealers. And it went on under Slaughter. It obviously was going on under Gandy, going on under Wallach, and they are the fiefdom that's actually running the city of Clearwater, in my opinion. There has been nothing said publicly about any reforms that are so desperately needed with the Clearwater Police Department. I've been standing, at this podium and others for nearly 8 years, floating the idea that we do not need Clearwater Police. Pinellas County Sheriff is primary law enforcement in the entire county, including this room. Not Clearwater Police. We don't need them. Would save somewhere in the neighborhood of $14 to $18 million a year if we contracted with the Sheriff's Department. But as far as available, affordable housing, Mr. Gandy doesn't live in Clearwater, not because he can't afford it. Mr. Wallach doesn't even live in Pinellas County. So that's a definition of community policing that I can't get behind.
Is there anyone else wishing to speak? This call or any comments by email?
No.
Thank you. I will now close public comment period. I'd like to ask if there are any final comments from the committee members.
I just have one comment on the parking, and we didn't really get into the parking reductions and so forth, but it refers to, as the gentleman mentioned, flexible standards, and I don't have issues with the parking reductions and requirements if I understood what those standards are. I'd like to know a little bit more about parking, to be honest. And I'll tell you, it comes from personal experience in my neighborhood with auxiliary dwelling units and triplexes and duplexes that are, have had flexible parking standards, which has caused a lot of, because everybody that's living 4 and 5, 7 people in a unit each have a car, parking on the street, parking across the sidewalk, parking on the grass, and it's not being enforced by the police department. So I'd like to have a better understanding when you're doing attainable workforce affordable housing, what those restrictions are and how they are going to be applied and how they're going to be enforced as time goes on. That's just my opinion in that regard. Everything else looks fine.
Lastly, I'd like Dylan Mayu, if he ask him if he has anything to add, anything more to report to the committee.
I don't have anything further at this time.
Our next AHAC meeting is scheduled for Tuesday, December 3rd at 9 a.m. in the council chambers here at the main library. The meeting is adjourned. Thank you.